Bill Maher leaned back in his chair, lips curling into the kind of grin that carried equal parts arrogance and dismissiveness. The audience chuckled nervously as he lobbed what he clearly thought was a clever line, one that dripped with the stale confidence of someone who had been rewarded for edginess far too many times before. But this time, the words landed differently. They weren't edgy. They weren't witty. They were a jab, racial, condescending, and casually cruel. The laughter wavered. Some shifted in their seats. The camera caught Maher basking in the pause, soaking in his own bravado. He thought he had the room. He thought he had her cornered. And then silence. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't fumble. For a brief, electric moment, she simply stared, her expression unreadable. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any shouted retort. The kind of silence that makes an audience lean in because they know something powerful is about to break loose. Maher chuckled again, filling the air as though to prove he still controlled it. But control had already shifted. Crockett tilted, her head slightly, her calm presence cutting through the awkward haze. And then, in a voice both measured and unshakable, she responded not with outrage, not with flustered defensiveness, but with a forceful clarity that made every word feel like a spotlight burning through the fog. Her tone wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a recalibration. She stripped away the joke's veneer, exposing it for what it truly was. An insult cloaked in sarcasm, a dismissal meant to minimize. She spoke with the precision of someone who had carried the weight of such remarks for years, but refused to let this one pass. The studio air shifted. That uneasy chuckle from moments earlier was gone. In its place was the kind of silence that belongs to history-making moments. The silence before an applause, before a reckoning, before a legacy. For Maher, the smirk began to falter. For Crockett, the momentum had only just begun. The audience didn't yet realize it, but they were witnessing the opening scene of a clash that would ricochet far beyond the studio walls. Because what Jasmine Crockett said next, no one was prepared for. It was supposed to be another episode, another panel, another night where Bill Maher would volley provocative takes across the table, while a rotating cast of politicians, pundits, and performers played along, laughed politely, and moved on. That was the formula. Controlled chaos. Controversy sanitized by studio lighting. But this wasn't just another night. The moment Jasmine Crockett responded, the ground shifted. Not because she raised her voice, but because she refused to lower her standards. She didn't play along. She didn't coddle the host, and in doing so, she punctured the carefully rehearsed balance of a show that had long walked the tightrope between progressive rhetoric and permissive prejudice. To understand the tremor that followed, you have to understand the pattern. There's an unspoken script in spaces like this, especially for Black women. Be sharp, but not too sharp. Defend your community, but don't sound angry. Educate the audience, but make them feel comfortable while doing it. If you bristle, you're combative. If you smile, you're complicit. And in that moment, Crockett tore the script in half. Because what Maher said wasn't just a gaffe, it was a mirror held up to decades of casual erasure. It was every dinner table where someone makes a racist joke and expects the Black woman present to laugh. It was every newsroom that labels Black women as difficult for refusing to be polite in the face of ignorance. It was every time media gatekeepers weaponized tone to discredit truth. But Maher wasn't just a proxy. He was a repeat offender. The smirk, the shrug, the "can't you take a joke?" cadence, it wasn't new. He'd flirted with the line before, dropped the N-word on live television, compared Muslim culture to mafia code, brushed off critiques as PC hysteria. It had all become part of the brand, until now. Because Crockett didn't just challenge the remark, she challenged the entire premise that someone like Bill Maher could keep using identity as a punchline and still be seen as the reasonable voice of liberal America. She exposed how the system props up men like him while demanding grace, patience, and restraint from women. Like her. And here's the irony. Her composure didn't make the moment smaller. It made it seismic. The audience saw it. The studio saw it. And soon the world would see it too. In that brief but thunderous exchange, the conversation went from commentary to confrontation, from harmless banter to cultural battle line, from late-night TV to generational reckoning. Because what happened next would echo far beyond the studio. To millions, Bill Maher is the sharp-tongued oracle of the political, left a comedian who turned late night into a battlefield of big ideas. He built his brand by taking aim at hypocrisy, skewering both parties with the precision of someone who claimed to sit above it all. For years, he was praised as the voice of reason in a chaotic media landscape. But behind the applause and panel debates, a pattern was hiding in plain sight. Bill Maher isn't a villain in the traditional sense. He doesn't scream slurs, wear slogans, or wave flags of hate. That's not his style. His weapon has always been the smirk, the kind of smug, self-congratulatory sarcasm that dances on the edge of offense and calls it free thought, the kind that delivers a punchline and then dares you to flinch. And for a long time, he got away with it. He was the guy who said what others were too afraid to say. When critics raised eyebrows, he waved the liberal flag, claiming independence from both right-wing dogma and left-wing sensitivity. But with every controversial monologue, every eyebrow-raising segment, a clearer image of Maher began to emerge, not as a neutral truth-teller, but as a man obsessed with being the exception. The cracks began early. In 2001, Maher's show, Politically Incorrect, was canceled after he questioned U.S. military policy in the wake of 9/11, not because he was wrong, but because America wasn't ready for nuance. That moment turned him into a martyr of political free speech. He wore it like armor. But as the years passed, his critiques stopped punching up and started punching sideways. In 2017, he casually dropped the N-word during an interview with Senator Ben Sasse. The audience laughed awkwardly. Maher waved it off. HBO apologized. Maher? He didn't. Instead, he doubled down on the idea that comedy should be untouchable, that context erased harm, that he, Bill Maher, couldn't be racist because he voted the right way. Then came the comments on Islam, comparing Muslim culture to a mafia, suggesting that billions of believers were somehow inherently less evolved. His defense: I'm not racist, I'm a realist. But realism, in Maher's world, has always looked a lot like prejudice dressed up as provocation. He's called young activists snowflakes, suggested that cancel culture is a bigger threat than institutional power, and repeatedly mocked identity politics while platforming voices that weaponize it. To him, identity is a prop, something to be analyzed, joked about, or dismissed, never truly respected. Yet he insists on calling himself a progressive. And that's the contradiction at the heart of Maher's persona. A man who believes he's fighting for equality, while refusing to listen to the people he claims to speak for. He demands deference, not dialogue. He treats disagreement as ingratitude. He claims to support marginalized communities so long as they don't make him uncomfortable. Maher doesn't hate people of color. He just doesn't think he has anything left to learn from them. That's the arrogance. That's the tragedy, because, for all his years in the spotlight, he still doesn't realize that true allyship isn't about speaking louder. It's about listening better. And therein lies the emotional fault line. Bill Maher isn't malicious. He's entitled. The kind of entitlement that believes voting blue and donating to the ACLU earns you a lifetime pass from accountability. The kind that says, I'm one of the good ones, while stepping on the very toes he pretends to march beside. For years, no one challenged that. Not really. Guests smiled, nodded, changed the subject. because to push back meant risking airtime, ridicule, or worse, being cast as too sensitive on a show that thrives on being tough. But this time, he picked the wrong guest. Long before she stepped onto that stage, long before the lights and the headlines, Jasmine Crockett was already fighting battles most people couldn't see. She was born in St. Louis, but built in Dallas, a city layered with contradictions. Skyscrapers towering over segregated neighborhoods. Southern hospitality colliding with systemic injustice. It was here that Jasmine began to understand what power looked like and who was denied it. As a young girl, she didn't dream of power for its own sake. She dreamed of fairness. She was the kind of child who asked too many questions in class, who challenged teachers when they skimmed over Black history, who wouldn't accept "because that's just the way it is" as an answer. That defiance didn't come from rebellion. It came from clarity. Even then, Jasmine Crockett saw the invisible lines drawn between people and decided she would spend her life redrawing them. She studied. She watched. She listened. But when it came time to speak, she did so with precision. Law school wasn't just a career path. It was a weapon. The courtroom, her proving ground. As a civil rights attorney, she didn't chase prestige. She chased justice. She defended protesters, stood beside grieving families, and stared down systems built to silence. She made a name for herself in Texas not by playing nice, but by playing smart. In a state that too often tried to shrink her voice, Jasmine made hers louder by making it sharper. Then came the leap into politics. Texas House, then Congress, each stage bigger, each battle harder. But Crockett didn't come to blend in. She came to disrupt. And disrupt she did. In a chamber full of scripted sound bites and empty performances, Jasmine brought fire wrapped in facts. Her clapbacks were viral, not because they were snarky, but because they were surgical. When Republican colleagues tried to rattle her with condescension, she answered with a calm that rattled them. She didn't just counter their talking points, she dismantled the entire premise they stood on. Audiences began to notice. So did her opponents. And yet, even as her profile grew, so did the pressure. The burden of being one of the few Black women in rooms where decisions were made without them. The expectation to be flawless, composed, never too loud, never too angry. She carried it all while still demanding more from a system built to offer less. But Crockett never asked for permission. She took space. She made moments. She brought the spirit of every woman who had ever been interrupted, every activist who had ever been ignored, every voter who had ever been told to wait their turn. So when she walked into that studio, it wasn't just another appearance. It was another battlefield. And she was already armored. To MAHER, this was just another night. Another guest to outwit. Another round of just kidding jabs. But for Jasmine, it was another space that had long excluded women like her. Another stage where truth had been too long filtered through smirks, not substance. And when MAHER made his remark, she didn't react like someone offended. She reacted like someone ready to show that intellect and identity were not mutually exclusive. That grace didn't mean passivity. That being composed didn't mean being complacent. Because this moment, this exact confrontation, wasn't an interruption in her journey. It was the destination. Every courtroom cross-examination, every committee hearing, every insult swallowed. In service of a bigger mission, it all led here. MAHER thought he was facing a politician. What he didn't realize was that he was facing a storm. And not just any storm, a storm forged in fire, honed in injustice, and driven by the kind of moral clarity you can't fake on live television. Jasmine Crockett didn't come to argue. She came to correct. And in that studio, she didn't just defend herself, she defended every woman who had ever been told to smile and sit still. She defended the idea that knowledge isn't owned by the elite, that dignity isn't up for debate, that you can wear hoop earrings and carry the Constitution in your mind with equal force. She's taken on Congress. What's one talk show host? And as the audience watched the tension rise, as Maher leaned further into his sarcasm, they had no idea that they weren't watching a debate. They were watching a reckoning. It started with the kind of comment Bill Maher thought he could slip in with a laugh. "Come on, Congresswoman," he said, eyes gleaming with faux charm. "You're not seriously going to say race still plays a role in success. We've had a black president, remember?" The studio chuckled lightly. Maher leaned back, self-satisfied. It was the kind of remark meant to sound clever, not cruel dismissive, without being overtly hostile. But it landed with the weight of every tired argument Black Americans had heard for decades. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. "I remember," she said, her voice level. "But I also remember that his presidency didn't magically end systemic racism." Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was surgical. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't raise her voice. She just spoke with the kind of poised restraint that made the room lean in. Maher raised an eyebrow. That grin, part confusion, part challenge, crept back across his face. "Well, if everything's still racist, then what's the point of progress?" he quipped. "At some point, don't we have to stop playing the oppression card?" This time the audience didn't laugh. There was a pause, a visible shift. Even the front row leaned back slightly, as if unsure of what they had just heard. Crockett let the silence breathe. Then, "It's not a card," she said. "It's a reality. And some of us don't get the luxury of pretending it ended just because it makes the conversation easier for you." Gasps. Small, scattered at first. Then a murmur like tension uncoiling across the room. Maher straightened up. His grin faded just a little. "Oh, don't get all sensitive on me," he said, waving a hand. "You're too smart for that." There. It was. The pivot. When cornered, Maher didn't reflect, he deflected. He reached for humor, the shield he'd always used to mask discomfort. But Crockett didn't let it slide. "I'm not being sensitive," she replied, eyes locked on his. "I'm being honest. There's a difference." Maher opened his mouth, ready to interject. She didn't flinch. "You invited me here to talk, so let me talk." Another murmur. A subtle stir. The kind of quiet that signals the audience is no longer sure who to root for and knows they're watching something that might go viral. Maher leaned forward again, trying to recover the momentum. "I just think we focus too much on victimhood," he said. "It disempowers people." "And pretending those victims don't exist?" Crockett asked. "That empowers who, exactly?" He didn't answer. Or maybe he couldn't. Her words were scalpel-sharp, stripping away the performance, leaving only the truth. And the more she spoke, the more Maher shrank behind his smile, his posture stiffening. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was a slow, methodical dismantling. The camera caught his hands fidgeting now, fingers tapping the edge of the desk. He tried again, softer this time, like a man trying to change the subject without conceding the point. "Look, I'm just saying we need more unity," he said. "And you're making it about division." Crockett paused. Her voice lowered. "Unity," she said, "without truth is just silence dressed up in civility." The audience fell silent. No gasps, no murmurs, just wait, because in that moment, the energy shifted again, not in Maher's favor, but in hers. The audience wasn't just watching a conversation. They were witnessing control change hands. He had interrupted. He had joked. He had tried sarcasm, then soft tones. But none of it worked. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't insulted him. She hadn't needed to. Because every time he swerved, she steered straight. Every time he smirked, she stared through it. And every time he tried to shrink the conversation, she widened it until he was small inside it. And then, Jasmine Crockett did the unthinkable. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still for a moment, hands folded, breath steady. The silence wasn't empty, it was loaded. The kind of silence that draws power instead of losing it. She looked at Maher, then scanned the audience, not to perform, but to connect. and then she spoke. "Bill," she said slowly, "the thing that bothers me the most isn't just what you said. It's what you believe you're saying." Maher blinked, caught off guard by the gentleness in her tone because it didn't come with softness. "You think you're being objective. You think you're cutting through the noise," she continued. "But what you're really doing is editing out the parts of the story that make you uncomfortable." The audience froze. She leaned in, not for effect, but for clarity. "You said earlier that we need more unity," she said. "But unity built on denial isn't unity, it's erasure. And people like me, we don't get erased quietly anymore." Maher shifted in his seat. His trademark smirk had thinned. His posture had stiffened. "You think racism is a chapter we already read," she said. "But some of us are still living it. Not because we want to. Not because we benefit from playing some oppression card. But because the system that made your voice loud still tells people like me to whisper." The audience let out a low, collective exhale. "You said Barack Obama proved that race doesn't matter," she said, now locking eyes. "But one man winning the presidency doesn't cancel out 400 years of stolen labor, redlining, voter suppression, police brutality, and generational wealth gaps. That's not progress. That's a symbol of what's possible. But symbols don't change systems." Maher tried to interject, but Crockett raised a finger not to silence, but to finish. "I came from a place where schools were underfunded, where the only time our zip code got national attention was when something tragic happened. I've had to code switch in courtrooms, in committee hearings, and even in media interviews just to be heard, not even agreed with. And I've watched how the same commentary that gets praised when coming from someone like you gets dismissed as radical when it comes from someone like me." Now the studio was still. "Let me give you a number," she said, her voice now a blade of calm. "Over 70% of black households in the U.S. still live without generational wealth. That's not because we didn't work hard. It's because every time we got a foothold, the goalposts moved." She paused. "Let it sink. That's not a sob story. That's not me being sensitive. That's data. That's America. The same America you joke about on Fridays, then leave behind when—" The cameras cut off. The camera panned to Maher, who was suddenly less composed. His eyes darted. His hands clenched slightly. "And what frustrates me," she continued, "is that people like you think your platform is neutral ground. But it's not. It's curated. You decide who gets to speak, what voices are valid, what kind of blackness is palatable. You say you want real conversations, but only if they don't challenge your comfort zone." A beat, then another. "And I'm tired," she said, now visibly emotional, but in control. "Tired of watching powerful men treat race like an occasional inconvenience, something to poke at for laughs, or wrap in irony, or reduce to a segment. I don't get to log off from this experience. I don't get to frame it as a joke, because when you're done with the discussion, I still have to live it." You could hear a pin drop. "Comedy is powerful," she said. "It can open minds, but it can also shut doors. And when it's used to silence, not spark, it stops being brave. It starts being cowardly." That one hit. "And the truth is," she said, standing her ground, "you're not afraid of cancel culture. You're afraid of accountability. Because for the first time in your career, people are telling you that your punchlines have a cost. And that cost is no longer invisible." A wave of murmurs began, audible now. A low tide of recognition. Crockett wasn't done. "You said earlier that people like me make it about race. But here's what you don't see. It's always about race. Not because we want it to be, but because America made it that way. And until people in power, people with platforms start acknowledging that, we're just spinning in circles." Her voice softened again. "You don't have to be the villain, Bill, but you do have to listen." That was it. For 2 long seconds, the studio remained silent. Then a single clap. Then another. Then more. The applause grew not like the typical Cue following studio response, but like something spontaneous. Earned. Maher didn't move. He glanced at the camera, then at the floor, then at Crockett, who had not just held her own, but shifted the center of gravity in the room. It wasn't about winning. It was about truth. And Jasmine Crockett had spoken a truth so sharp, so layered, so undeniable, that the audience wasn't applauding a soundbite. They were applauding a stand. The clip would go viral within hours, but in that moment, none of them were thinking about headlines. They were thinking about how it felt to watch someone speak with that much clarity, that much composure, that much righteous weight. Maher had brought a smirk, Crockett had brought a mirror, and the reflection staring back at him wasn't flattering. She didn't gloat. She didn't monologue. She simply sat back, poised, as if everything she needed to say had been said. The air was different now, heavier, wiser. But the internet was just getting started. By the time the episode wrapped, the tremors had already begun. The clip hit Twitter first 37 seconds of Jasmine Crockett dismantling Bill Maher's narrative with calm, cutting clarity. Someone captioned it, "She peeled him like an onion." Team Crockett. The tweet exploded. Within hours, Team Crockett was trending in 7 major cities. By morning, it had overtaken real-time HBO. Commentators, comedians, and congressional colleagues weighed in. The message wasn't just that Jasmine had won, it was that she had changed the rules of engagement. One tweet read, "This wasn't a debate. It was a masterclass in power, dignity, and truth." Jasmine Crockett didn't clap back. She stood tall. Maher exposed, TikTok followed fast. Edits popped up overnight. Split-screen montages of Crockett's calm face beside Maher's twitching. Reactions. Creators slowed down her delivery, overlaid text like, "Watch how she lets the silence do the damage." POV. Maher realizes he's not the smartest person in the room. And black women always cleaning up the mess. Within 48 hours, a remix went viral. Crockett's takedown set to Kendrick Lamar's "All Right." It racked up over 2 million views by the weekend. News outlets couldn't ignore it. MSNBC aired the clip under the banner, "Crockett takes Maher to task." CNN called it a moment of reckoning on liberal gatekeeping. Online headlines read like digital confetti. Jasmine Crockett just gave Bill Maher a lesson in reality. The Root, mic drop of the year. Rolling Stone, this is what representation looks like. Teen Vogue. On The View, co-host Sunny Hostin praised Crockett for doing what so many of us have wanted to do for years, challenge the liberal voices who weaponize race under the guise of reason. And then came the celebrity reactions. Ava DuVernay tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett, remember the name, because this is the kind of voice we need at the table, behind the camera, on every platform." Respect, Kerry Washington shared the clip with a simple, powerful caption. "That's how you do it." Even Chance the Rapper reposted it on Instagram stories, writing, "This ain't just a takedown, this is truth-telling." Crockett herself posted nothing. No retweets, no hashtags, just a single Instagram post. A photo of her sitting calm and composed on the set, captioned, "Say less." But her silence only fueled the reaction. Because by now, Jasmine wasn't just trending, she was resonating. Black Twitter crowned her a queen. Activist circles praised her tone, her timing, her tactical dismantling of a media power structure that too often dismissed voices like hers. White allies amplified her words, reflecting on their own blind spots. It wasn't just Crockett's command of facts. It was her refusal to be rattled, her choice to teach without pandering, her poise under pressure that made people stop scrolling and start listening. Clips from the episode became required viewing in college classrooms. DEI seminars circulated the footage as an example of grace under fire. And across living rooms, group chats, and family dinners, people weren't just watching her, they were talking about her. A viral Reddit thread in Our Political Video had the top comment, "Crockett didn't argue," she testified. And it landed like gospel. Even late-night hosts chimed in. Trevor Noah joked, "Bill Maher finally found someone who could out-Bill Maher him." And it was a congresswoman from Texas. The shockwaves weren't just digital, they were cultural. This wasn't a flash-in-the-pan controversy. It was a litmus test for where America's discourse was heading. For decades, figures like MAHER had claimed to be the gatekeepers of progressivism. But now, someone had walked through the gate and built a new one. Jasmine Crockett became the measuring stick for political clarity. Her name entered public consciousness not as a soundbite, but as a symbol. And just when the noise seemed to peak, when the trending tabs were still flashing and the media outlets were still clipping quotes, something unexpected happened. An open letter circulated online, signed by professors, activists, artists, and journalists. It wasn't just praising Crockett, it was demanding more space for voices like hers. Let her host, let her lead, let her shape the room, it read, because something had shifted. The air was different now, and everyone felt it. But Crockett wasn't finished. When the applause faded and the headlines moved on, what lingered wasn't just a moment. It was a message. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk onto that stage to perform. She walked on with purpose, and in those few minutes against the grain of the usual late-night spectacle, she reframed what accountability looks like when spoken with dignity. This wasn't about a viral clip. It wasn't even about Bill Maher. It was about a pattern one that has existed in media, politics, and everyday conversation for generations. A pattern where power disguises itself as progress, where allyship is claimed but never earned, where voices are invited, but only if they remain agreeable. And Jasmine Crockett said, "No more." Her words rang out far beyond that studio, because they weren't just crafted, they were lived. Every sentence was a brick laid by experience, by history, by a lineage of black women who have had to choose between being heard and being palatable. In speaking plainly, she exposed something that can't be unseen. The liberal spaces that pride themselves on inclusion, yet instinctively recoil when inclusion speaks with its own voice. The platforms that claim to welcome difference, but only so long as that difference is comfortable. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. She reminded us that progress isn't just measured by who sits at the table, but by who is allowed to speak without compromise, without translation, without needing to shrink their truth to fit someone else's narrative. For too long, harm has been masked by humor, dismissiveness dressed up as debate. But as Crockett showed the world, we can't keep laughing off harm just because it's well articulated. And we can't keep mistaking discomfort for danger. Sometimes the most uncomfortable truth is also the most necessary. She didn't scold. She didn't shame. She simply refused to make herself smaller, and in that refusal, she gave millions permission to do the same. To the black women watching from home, it wasn't just satisfying, it was affirming. It was proof that your calm doesn't have to mean silence, that your grace doesn't require erasure, that you can show up, speak out, and still be whole afterward. To allies who truly want to grow, it was a masterclass in listening not to win, not to counter, but to understand. Crockett didn't just model courage, she modeled clarity, the kind that cuts through posturing and speaks directly to the core. And to the institutions still deciding who gets to speak, and how they now have a new benchmark because Jasmine Crockett didn't just hold her ground. She redefined it. She turned a casual insult into a cultural inflection point. She transformed what could have been just another uncomfortable segment into a national mirror. She reminded us that identity is not a gimmick, that lived experience is not a liability, and that representation, when backed by truth, is more than powerful. It's unstoppable. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself. She spoke for every black woman who's been interrupted, dismissed, or reduced to a punchline. She spoke for everyone who's been told they were too much when they were simply enough. She spoke for justice not with vengeance, but with vision. And perhaps, most importantly, she proved that dignity is not up for debate. Not anymore. Not ever again. Bill Maher thought he was hosting a conversation. What he got was a confrontation with truth, with history, with the limits of his own perspective. He crossed a line. Jasmine Crockett didn't just call it out, she redrew it. What played out on that stage wasn't just a verbal takedown. It was a reckoning, a turning point in how we measure power, how we define allyship, and how we hold public voices accountable, not just for what they say, but for what they continue to ignore. Jasmine Crockett didn't come to clap back. She came to recalibrate. And in doing so, she reminded the world that you don't need to shout to be powerful, and you don't need to humiliate to hold someone accountable. You only need the truth and the courage to say it out loud. So if you felt that moment in your chest, if you watched her hold her ground and saw a piece of yourself in her stance, her calm, her fire, share this. If you've ever wished someone would say the thing you were too tired to say, subscribe, because this isn't just about one moment, one host, or one network. This is about the shift we're living through, the shift you are a part of. Voices like Jasmine Crockett's aren't just rising, they're roaring. And it's time to amplify them, because when truth sounds like that, the world has to listen.